So what you have is a whole generation of people, Deevy's generation, who see writing for theatre as something that they need to do. And what's astonishing is that throughout the 1920s, 1930s, into the 1940s, a lot of Irish people start to write plays. In those decades, the Abbey was receiving something like 300 unsolicited manuscripts a year. And when you think of it, there can't have been too many people in Ireland who didn't write a play in those years. Ireland's not that big. So there's a phenomenal amount of kind of theatrical activity happening. So Deevy is part of that, and she starts writing plays in the late 20s. The first play that she sends to the Abbey that we know about is one called Reserved Ground. It was rejected, but the person who read it was Lennox Robinson. Now, friends of the Mint will know Lennox Robinson because his play Is Life Worth Living was staged right here this time last year. Robinson was the artistic director of the Abbey, very influential figure in Irish theatre. And so when Deevy sent him a later play called The Reapers in 1930, he staged it and directed it. What we have after that is a period where Deevy becomes extraordinarily prolific. She has, as I say, The Reapers in 1930. She has a one-act play called The Disciple in 1931. A play called Temporal Powers, staged in 1932, which I believe the Mint is looking at doing next year. In a period of about 5 years, she has a whole run of plays, almost more or less a play a year. So there's a sense in which she was very much on the inside. She came from a very respectable middle-class family. One of her brothers became a very successful accountant, another one became a Jesuit priest. She knew people in the theatre world, like Lennox Robinson. She wrote letters to people like Frank O'Connor, the Irish writer. She was involved with the Irish chapter of PEN, the writers' organization. She campaigned against literary censorship. She was in some ways on the inside. So why is it that I think of her behind this wall of glass? Let me just read you something from the first mention that I've found in the Irish newspapers of the play that'll be on later on this afternoon, Wife to James Whelan. This is from March 14th, 1942 from the Irish Times. And the paper says this: Miss Teresa Deevy, one of the most remarkable playwrights of Ireland, has completed a new play, which under the title of Wife to James Whelan will be produced at the Abbey Theatre. It wasn't. Miss Deevy, though handicapped by an almost total absence of hearing, is a tireless worker, and her plays are considered to be among the more excellent stage representations of the intricate workings of the mind. I'm going to come back to that her plays are about the intricate workings of the mind. Despite her disability, she can follow and enjoy stage productions of her contemporaries and her own with the aid of a manuscript, helped by her cultivated talent for lip reading. Now, I think today there's probably a slightly condescending tone to that. In many ways, we've moved beyond the concept of disability, particularly in theatre, and the fact that she was hearing impaired might not be quite as remarkable to us today. But I think to look at Deevy in the context of the culture of 1930s Ireland and what it would mean to have a hearing impairment at that time will give us a sense of her position in relation to Irish literary culture at the time. Because one of the defining features of Irish culture in the 1930s and 40s was that it was a culture of talk. If you were to do a quick poll of people of the things they associate with Ireland, I would guess that on most people's lists somewhere would be the Irish pub. A couple of years ago, I was asked to go to Beijing, actually, to lecture on Irish drama, to talk about Irish drama. And the one thing I very quickly learned was that all of my students, if there were two things they knew about Ireland, one was the Irish pub, and the other was river dance. And that was, I could assume river dance in the Irish pub, and beyond that, I wasn't quite sure. That Irish pubs, pubs are synonymous with Ireland. And of course, there are Irish pubs everywhere. There are Irish pubs in Beijing, Monte Carlo, Krakow, and Sao Paulo. There are Irish pubs all around the world. In the 1930s, the pub was very much the center of a lot of Irish literary culture. And just actually as a kind of footnote, there's a whole debate in Ireland at the moment as to whether or not the Irish pub is dying. In the last 3 years, there have been something like 900 rural pubs have closed. More sensible attitudes to drinking and driving, longer working hours, and other factors that actually made pub going less what it was in Ireland. But in the 1930s, pub going was very much the center of a lot of the culture, and particularly the center of the literary culture. There were people like, for instance, the editor of the Irish Times at the time, a man named Robert Smiley, legendary figure, larger than life in every aspect, whose working day usually began about the middle of the afternoon. He'd arrive in the Irish Times office, do only what he absolutely had to do in the Irish Times office, and very quickly decamp to the Palace Bar across the road. And the newspaper, for about 3 decades, was effectively run from the back room of the Palace Bar with a pint of Arthur Guinness's finest in one hand. And there would be poets in there, writers in there, journalists. I mean, this is the kind of culture that nurtured people like Brendan Behan, who, Behan once famously said, I only drink on 2 occasions, when I'm thirsty and when I'm not thirsty. It is this kind of culture. Now there's part of me, there's a tendency to romanticize this, and there's part of me that thinks that must have been an awful lot of fun. And it was certainly a culture of very lively talk. But there's also, I think, part of me that thinks that when a writer spends a lot of their time on drink and on talk, they're not writing. And that for, I think, a lot of writers of that generation, drink and talk were alibis for not writing the great works they could have written. And there's a whole generation of Irish writers in this period, in the 30s and the 40s, who are almost great. People like Behan, people like the poet Patrick Kavanagh, the comic writer Flann O'Brien, who almost write the great book, almost write the great poem, but don't quite. And I sometimes wonder, was drink a sort of alibi for that? Sure, I could have written a great novel, but I was fluthered. That sort of thing. Because this is the generation who came after. They came after the generation of Yeats, after the generation of Joyce, after the generation of John Millington Synge. That when you come after a great generation, it must be very difficult. One of the things I always find interesting is the first play produced in the Abbey after Irish independence in 1922 was called Aftermath. That there's a sense of kind of living in the aftermath of great events in Ireland in the 1930s. The kind of claims that had been made for what Ireland would be like after independence had been fairly extravagant. Here's Pádraig Pearse, one of the leaders of the 1916 Rising. He wrote this in 1916. "A free Ireland," he wrote, "would govern herself as no external power, nay, not even a government of angels or archangels could govern her." Now, Ireland in the 1930s, like the rest of the Western world, was going through an economic depression. Ireland didn't have a lot in the way of natural resources. It was not governed the way angels or archangels would govern it. There was a huge sense in Irish culture, in so many different ways in those years, of disappointment. And one of the things that Teresa Deevy captures is that sense. There's a letter that she wrote in 1939 to her friend Florence Hackett, and again, this is unpublished, this is from the manuscripts of her letters in the National Library. And she's talking about a play that I actually haven't found mentioned anywhere else, so it may have been retitled and became something else. A play called Port of Refuge. And she asks her friend, she says, "Tell me what you think of Port of Refuge. I liked the way it brought out the disillusionment that follows on from getting what we have put too much store in having." The disillusionment of getting, that follows on getting what we have put too much store in having. The play which you're probably going to see here this afternoon, the play that's on here this afternoon, The Wife of James Whelan, in some ways, that could sum up that play. The disillusionment that follows on getting what you put too much store in having, particularly in relation to the character of James Whelan himself. Somebody who's constantly wanting something, and when he gets it, it just isn't enough. It's not what he thought it was going to be.